My father included only my two stepbrothers in the inheritance, while I received an inheritance of $15 million. Suddenly, distant relatives remembered me, and my mother filed a lawsuit. It's hard to describe what it feels like to grow up feeling like an intruder in your own home. I guess it all started when I was 14, the year my mom, Kate, married Tom. At that time, it was just her and me against the world, or at least that's what I thought. After my dad left when I was young, it was the two of us through everything. We didn't have much, but we managed. She'd always tell me I was the only thing that mattered. Her rock, the reason she kept going. I never thought I'd see that change so fast. When she met Tom, it was like I stopped existing. Tom was well off, successful in his career, and he had a son of his own, Alex. Mom lit up around him, maybe because he seemed like a solution to all our problems. And at first, I tried to see the positives too. I mean, Tom had a big house, way nicer than the apartments we'd bounced around in. He took my mom on dates, bought her gifts, and even paid for some things she needed. For a minute, I thought, maybe this is a good thing. But it didn't take long before I realized how much I'd underestimated the situation. Moving into Tom's house felt less like finding a new home and more like stepping into enemy territory. I quickly noticed I was an outsider, a guest overstaying his welcome. The house itself was beautiful, a big yard, tons of space, rooms that didn't even seem to get used. But every inch felt like it belonged to Tom and Alex, not me. I guess I should have seen it coming when Tom made it clear he didn't want me redecorating my room. My mom brushed it off, saying, "Oh, he's just particular. He likes things a certain way." It became clear Tom didn't like things my way. In the beginning, Tom was polite but distant. He never once tried to make small talk, and if he did speak to me, it was always in a flat, unemotional tone. "No, how was your day?" Or "How's school going?" Just "Don't leave your shoes in the hall," or "Make sure you turn off the lights." I don't think he ever looked at me as anything other than Kate's kid. He didn't treat me like I was part of the family. And when I asked my mom why he acted like that, she'd just sigh and tell me he needed time to adjust. "This is new for him too, Ben," she'd say, as if I wasn't the one who had to upend my whole life. Then there was Alex, Tom's son, who was only a year younger than me. From the start, he was everything his dad wanted. Smart, athletic, popular, the kind of kid who seemed to get along with everyone. People always liked Alex, and I could see why. He was charming and confident, the type who'd throw parties in high school and have everyone lining up to get in. Meanwhile, I was awkward, quiet, maybe a little too into video games and comics. We couldn't have been more different, and that difference was painfully obvious whenever we were in the same room. Alex had his own friends, and I had mine. But slowly, he started to turn my friends against me. He'd make subtle digs, comments that seemed harmless on the surface but would get under your skin. Things like, "Ben's a bit of a loner, isn't he?" Or, "I don't know why you'd want to spend so much time with him." Pretty soon, my friends stopped coming around. I'd hear them laugh and joke with Alex, while I sat alone in my room, pretending not to care. Over time, Alex started making snide remarks to my face, usually when no one else was around. He'd laugh and say things like, "Dad didn't even want you guys here," or "You're just lucky my dad's got a soft spot for charity cases." I'd try to brush it off, but deep down, those words stung. I knew he was only saying what his dad probably thought, but never dared to say out loud. Mom's response to all of this? Denial. She was too caught up in her new life with Tom to notice what was happening with me. I'd try to tell her about the way Tom ignored me, or how Alex was turning people against me, and she'd just brush it off. "Ben, don't be so sensitive. They're just adjusting." Adjusting, she'd say, like it was supposed to make everything okay. She'd get defensive anytime I said anything negative about Tom or Alex, almost as if protecting them was more important than standing up for her own son. Eventually, I stopped trying to talk to her. Every time I did, it felt like I was banging my head against a wall. She'd give me the same tired response, that I needed to give them time, that things would get better. But they didn't. If anything, things got worse. Tom was strict, with a set of rules for everything, and it seemed like those rules only applied to me. I couldn't leave dishes in the sink. I couldn't use the TV after 10 p.m. I had to keep my room spotless. But Alex? He could do whatever he wanted. Tom would excuse it, saying, "Boys will be boys," as if I wasn't one of those boys too. It felt like he was always watching, waiting for me to slip up so he could remind me that this was his house, that I was just a guest. I remember one night when I accidentally left my backpack in the living room. I was exhausted, had a huge project due the next day, and it just slipped my mind. Tom found it before I did and brought it to me with this look, like I just insulted him. "Ben, in this house, we don't leave our things lying around," he said, his voice cold. "If you can't follow the rules, maybe you should consider finding another place to live." It was a slap in the face. I was barely 16, and he was already talking like he wanted me gone. At school, things weren't much better. Alex's influence had spread. It wasn't just my friends who ignored me now. It was everyone. Teachers, classmates, even people who didn't know me seemed to look through me like I didn't exist. Rumors started circulating about me. How I was antisocial, how I had a weird home life. It didn't take a genius to figure out where those rumors were coming from. Alex had a way of turning everything around to make himself look like the victim and me like the problem. I started spending more and more time alone, hiding out in my room whenever I was home, avoiding Tom and Alex at all costs. My grades slipped, not that anyone noticed. I figured if no one else cared, why should I? I felt trapped, like no matter where I went, I was never going to escape this feeling of being unwanted, of being in a place I didn't belong. The only real support I had was from my best friend, Ethan. He'd known me since before all this, back when it was just me and Mom against the world. He knew what I was going through, understood the isolation I felt. We'd hang out after school sometimes, and I'd vent about everything, from Tom's rules to Alex's torment. He'd listen, nodding along, and he'd tell me I just had to survive a few more years until we could get out of this town, start fresh somewhere else. It was a comforting thought, but it didn't make the day-to-day any easier. One night, Ethan and I were talking, and he asked me something that stuck with me. "Ben, have you ever tried just confronting them? Telling them what's really on your mind?" I laughed it off, saying there was no way that would make a difference, but the idea stayed with me. Part of me wondered what would happen if I just laid it all out, told Tom and Alex exactly what I thought of them. But the thought of confronting them, of potentially making things even worse, was terrifying. I didn't have the courage, and I knew my mom wouldn't back me up. She'd pick them over me in a heartbeat, that much was obvious. As the years went on, I stopped trying to be part of the family. I accepted that I was an outsider, that this wasn't my home. I focused on getting through each day, keeping my head down, waiting for the day I could leave and never look back. But the scars from those years stayed with me. Even now, I can still hear Tom's voice in my head, reminding me that this wasn't my place, that I didn't belong. Looking back, I wish I'd stood up for myself more, that I'd fought back instead of just taking it. But when you're a kid, and you're surrounded by people who make you feel small, it's hard to find the strength to fight. All I could do was survive, and sometimes that felt like enough. If I thought things were bad before, I had no idea how much worse they could get. Living in Tom's house had already made me feel like I didn't belong, but when my half-brother Liam was born, it was like I disappeared completely. Overnight, I became a ghost in my own home. Tom and Mom were so wrapped up in their new perfect family that I was barely an afterthought. It's hard to describe the feeling of watching everyone you live with move on without you. I'd wake up to the sound of Liam crying in the middle of the night, which felt like a constant reminder that he was the center of their world now. Tom would rush to take care of him, and Mom would follow, all soft smiles and adoring glances. When she looked at Liam, her whole face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. I don't think she ever looked at me like that after Tom came into the picture. With Liam's arrival, it was like every tiny annoyance Tom had with me got blown up 10 times over. If I left a glass in the sink, he'd be on me about respecting the space because now we had to keep things clean for the baby. If I wanted to watch TV, I had to keep the volume practically on mute because Liam needed his rest. Everything I did somehow became an inconvenience to Tom and my mom. She'd make excuses, saying they were just adjusting to having a newborn. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about that. I was simply in the way. One night, about a month after Liam was born, I was eating dinner alone at the kitchen table while Tom and Mom were in the living room with Liam. I could hear them laughing and talking, cooing over every little sound he made. It was like a scene from a happy family movie, except I was watching it from the outside. Halfway through my meal, Alex sauntered into the kitchen and took a seat across from me, a smug grin on his face. "You know, they're a lot happier without you around," he said, almost casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my food, but he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Face it, Ben. You're just the leftover." That was a punch to the gut. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just Alex being Alex, but those words stayed with me. In my heart, I knew he was just saying what everyone else was thinking but wouldn't admit out loud. As the weeks passed, things got worse. Every little thing I did seemed to annoy Tom, and Alex took every chance he got to make me feel even smaller. Anytime Mom and Tom had friends or family over to meet Liam, I felt like the invisible guest, the kid no one remembered to include in the family photos. They'd pass Liam around, cooing over him like he was the most precious thing on earth, while I sat awkwardly in the background, pretending I was okay with it. One of the worst nights came when they hosted a big family dinner to celebrate Liam's first few months. The house was full of relatives I'd barely met, all of them fawning over the new addition to the family. I was at the table, trying to make myself as small as possible when Tom's sister, Susan, leaned over and asked, "Oh, Kate, who's this?" Like I was some stranger who'd wandered in off the street. "Oh, that's Ben," my mom replied, her tone almost dismissive. "He's my son from before." From before. Like I was part of some other life she barely remembered. Tom didn't even try to introduce me, and Susan gave me this awkward smile before turning her attention right back to Liam. I spent the rest of that dinner just trying to keep my head down, but Alex wouldn't let it go. Under the table, he'd kick my leg, whispering insults every chance he got. Things like, "Nobody even notices you," or "You're such an embarrassment." I wanted to yell, to scream at him, but I knew that if I did, I'd just be the problem kid causing a scene. So I bottled it up, swallowing every insult until I felt like I was going to explode. Things hit a breaking point a few weeks later. I was having a rough day at school, had a big project due, got called out by the teacher for not paying attention, and some of the guys on the basketball team were picking on me. When I finally got home, all I wanted was a quiet night to myself. But when I walked into the kitchen, Alex was there, leaning against the counter with that smug look on his face. "Hey, Ben," he sneered, "heard you had a rough day. Makes sense. You're not exactly cut out for much, are you?" I clenched my fists, trying to hold back my anger. "Just leave me alone, Alex." But he wasn't finished. "You know, Liam's going to be 100 times better than you ever were. At least Dad actually wants him around." That was it. I snapped. I shoved him, harder than I meant to, and he stumbled back, hitting the counter. In an instant, Tom came storming in, his face red with anger. He didn't even ask what happened. He just assumed the worst. "What the hell are you doing, Ben?" he yelled. "Are you seriously starting fights now? In this house?" I tried to explain, tried to tell him what Alex had said, but he wouldn't listen. "I don't care what your excuse is," he snapped. "You don't get to treat people like that here. Maybe it's time you learned some respect." Mom came in just as he was lecturing me, her face a mix of disappointment and frustration. She didn't even look at me. She just took Tom's side, like she always did. "Ben, you need to apologize," she said, her voice tired. "This behavior isn't acceptable." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her how unfair it all was, how they pushed me aside, how Alex was the one who made my life a living hell every day. But looking at their faces, I knew it wouldn't matter. In their eyes, I was the problem. After that night, things spiraled even further. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, tiptoeing around the house, trying to avoid Tom, Alex, and even my own mom. I spent as much time as I could away from home, crashing at Ethan's place or hiding out in the library. Anything to avoid going back to that house, where I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Eventually, I stopped even trying to be noticed. I'd come home, go straight to my room, and stay there until I had to go back to school. I'd hear them laughing and talking downstairs, sometimes playing with Liam or making plans for the weekend, and it felt like a knife twisting in my chest every time. I knew they didn't want me around, that I was just a leftover from a life my mom had outgrown. One day, I got home from school to find that my room had been reorganized. Tom had moved some of my stuff to make space for a crib, apparently deciding my room was a convenient spot for Liam's naps. My own room wasn't even mine anymore. It was just another part of their house. That night, I finally broke down. I called Ethan, my voice barely holding together as I told him everything. He listened, as he always did, and told me I deserved better, that I shouldn't have to live like this. But I knew I didn't have a choice. I was trapped, caught between a family that didn't want me and a life that felt like it was slipping away. I remember sitting in the dark that night, staring at the walls of a room that no longer felt like mine, wondering how much longer I could keep going. Turning 18 was something I had looked forward to for years. While most of my friends were planning for graduation parties and deciding where they'd go to college, I had one clear goal: get out. I'd spent enough time feeling like a stranger in my own family, constantly reminded by Tom, Alex, and even Mom that I didn't belong. Moving out was my only way forward, the only way I'd finally have control over my life. I started working as soon as I was old enough. I'd gotten a job at a local grocery store bagging groceries and stocking shelves. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was low, but it was something. I saved every dollar I could, only spending money on things I absolutely needed. My friends would go out after school, grabbing burgers or going to the movies, but I always had an excuse. Saving up for something big, I'd say with a grin, though I never told them what that big thing was. They thought I was saving for a car, or maybe college, but the truth was, I was saving for my freedom. Working kept me busy, gave me an excuse to be out of the house, and over time, I started taking on extra shifts. The manager, Jason, was a bit of a hard ass, but he respected my work ethic. We didn't talk much at first. He was one of those no-nonsense types who barked orders and expected things done his way. But one night, after the store closed, I stayed late to clean up a huge mess in aisle 6, where someone had knocked over a display of pasta sauce. As I was mopping up tomato sauce splatters, Jason came over, watched me for a moment, and then nodded. "You're a hard worker, Ben," he said, surprising me. "Most kids your age would have left this for the morning crew." I shrugged. "Just trying to do a good job." From that day on, Jason started giving me more responsibilities. He'd let me work the register sometimes, and eventually, he even trusted me to lock up at night. With every extra responsibility came a little more pay, which brought me one step closer to my goal. Meanwhile, back home, things were as tense as ever. Tom had started making more digs about my future, dropping comments about how I needed a plan. He'd sit down with Alex, talking about which colleges he should apply to, which sports scholarships he might be able to get. Meanwhile, he'd barely even look at me. When he did talk to me, it was only to lecture me about my grades or ask why I hadn't applied for any colleges. "You're 18 now, Ben," he said one night, standing in the doorway of my room. "You need to think about what you're going to do with your life. Are you planning to just bag groceries forever?" I bit back the urge to snap at him, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm working on it," I said simply. "Well, I hope so," he replied, his tone dripping with disdain. "I don't plan to support you forever." That was the last straw for me. I had been saving for 2 years, and while I didn't have enough to live luxuriously, I had enough to cover a deposit and a couple of months' rent on a cheap apartment. That night, I made the decision. I was moving out. The next day, I pulled Mom aside. I could see the surprise in her eyes when I told her my plan. I half expected her to try and talk me out of it, but she just sighed, looking more tired than anything else. "Ben, are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked quietly. "I'm sure, Mom. I need to do this for myself. I can't keep living here, feeling like I don't belong." She looked down, biting her lip, but eventually, she nodded. "If that's what you want, I guess I can't stop you." Telling Tom, on the other hand, was a nightmare. I waited until everyone was home, hoping to make it quick and to the point. I explained that I'd saved enough, that I was ready to be on my own. Tom's face went red immediately. "You think you're just going to walk out of here and everything will be easy," he snapped. "Life doesn't work like that, Ben. You're going to fall flat on your face." I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to shout back. "Maybe, but it's my decision." Alex, sitting on the couch, looked smug. "Good luck, man. You're gonna need it." Even as I packed my things, Tom kept up his rant, saying I was making a mistake, that I was being selfish. Mom tried to calm him down, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes too. It hurt, but I reminded myself that I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for me. Finally, with my few boxes packed into the back of my friend Ethan's car, I left. The last thing I saw as we pulled out of the driveway was Mom standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching me go. I wanted to believe she was sad to see me leave, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that she was relieved. My first night in my new apartment was one of the best nights of my life. The place was small, barely big enough for a twin bed and a dresser, with a tiny kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. But it was mine. No Tom, no Alex, no feeling like I was an intruder in someone else's home. For the first time in years, I felt free. Ethan helped me move in, and we celebrated by ordering cheap pizza and sitting on the floor, talking about the future. He was planning to go to community college nearby, so we'd still see each other often. I told him about my plans to keep working, maybe eventually go back to school myself once I'd saved enough. Over the next few months, I settled into a routine. I worked long hours, picked up any extra shifts I could get, and slowly started to make the apartment feel like home. I bought a secondhand couch from a thrift store, found some old posters to put on the walls, and even got a couple of houseplants. I'd come home at night, exhausted but satisfied, knowing that everything I had, I'd earned myself. One day, I got a text from Mom, asking if I'd come over for dinner. I hadn't seen her since I moved out, and part of me was curious. I missed her, in spite of everything. When I showed up, she greeted me with a hug, a bit awkward, like she wasn't sure if I'd pull away. The dinner was strained, with Tom making passive-aggressive comments about my independent lifestyle and Alex barely acknowledging my presence. Mom tried to keep things light, asking about my job, but it was clear that Tom wasn't happy to have me there. After dinner, as I was getting ready to leave, Mom pulled me aside. "Ben, you know you're always welcome to come back if things get hard." I shook my head. "Thanks, Mom, but I'm okay. I'm better this way." As I left, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The years of feeling trapped, of feeling like an outsider, were finally behind me. I had my own place, my own life, and for the first time in forever, I felt like I could breathe. I guess a part of me had always known I was an outsider in that family, but finding out about Tom's will was the final nail in the coffin. By then, I'd been living on my own for over a year. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was getting by. I'd managed to save a little, started taking a few classes at the community college, and I felt, okay. I was slowly building a life I could be proud of, away from the constant judgment and cold stares that used to be my daily reality. One day, I got a call from Mom. She asked if I'd come by for lunch that weekend. She didn't say much, but her voice had a strange tone to it, nervous, maybe, like she was holding something back. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I hadn't been back in the house much since I left. I'd come for the occasional holiday or Mom's birthday, but it was always uncomfortable. Tom would sit there with his arms crossed, barely acknowledging me, while Alex would make snide comments, just like old times. Even though I was out, even though I'd built my own life, being around them brought back every awful memory. When I arrived that Saturday, Mom greeted me at the door, giving me a tight hug. It felt strange, like she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Inside, everything was as I remembered, too perfect, too pristine, like a house staged for a real estate listing instead of a place where people actually lived. Tom was sitting in the living room, barely looking up as I walked in. Alex was lounging on the couch, a smug smile plastered on his face. Liam, now a rambunctious toddler, was running around with a toy truck, blissfully unaware of any tension. After a few minutes of small talk, Tom cleared his throat, glancing at me for the first time since I arrived. "Ben," he began, in that cold, emotionless tone I'd heard 1,000 times before. "There's something we need to discuss as a family." The word family stung, considering I'd never really felt like I was part of theirs. I braced myself, nodding for him to go on. "I've recently updated my will," Tom continued, pausing to exchange a look with Mom. She looked down, avoiding my gaze, and my stomach dropped. I want to be transparent with everyone about my decisions, so there are no surprises down the road. I could feel Alex's eyes on me, practically gleaming with satisfaction. Part of me wanted to get up and walk out, but I stayed, holding my breath as Tom went on. In the event of my passing, my assets will be divided equally between Alex and Liam, he said, his tone casual, almost businesslike. I've made sure that they'll be taken care of, that their future is secure. He paused, looking at me with a blank expression. No explanation, no apology, just a statement of fact. I felt the weight of his words settling over me, each syllable driving home the reality that I'd been right all along. I wasn't part of this family. I was just there, a loose end, an afterthought. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, numb, while everyone watched me, waiting for a reaction. I glanced at Mom, hoping for some sign of disagreement, some acknowledgement of how hurtful this was. But she just sat there, her eyes fixed on the floor, saying nothing. Finally, I found my voice. So, you're cutting me out entirely? I asked, trying to keep the bitterness out of my tone. Tom shrugged, looking unfazed. It's not about cutting you out, Ben. It's about securing a legacy for my sons. Alex and Liam, they're my blood. You have your own life now, your own future. I trust you'll find your own way. The words felt like a slap. My own way? Was that all I was to him? A loose thread in his otherwise perfect life? I'd always known he didn't see me as his son, but hearing it spelled out like that, so matter-of-factly, was like a punch to the gut. I looked at Mom again, desperate for some kind of reassurance, anything to show that she still cared. But she just avoided my gaze, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. You know, I said slowly, my voice trembling, I always knew I wasn't a part of this family, but I never thought you'd make it so obvious. Alex snorted, a smug grin spreading across his face. Oh, come on, Ben. Don't act surprised. This was always how it was going to be. Dad's just doing what's fair. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the anger building inside me. Fair? You think this is fair? Tom sighed, looking irritated. Ben, let's not turn this into a spectacle. I'm trying to be honest with you, to treat you like an adult. You're old enough to understand these things. Family legacy, inheritance, it's not about feelings. It's about responsibility. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd spent years living under his roof, trying to be part of this family, sacrificing my own happiness just to keep the peace. And now, he was telling me that none of that mattered because, in his eyes, I was never family in the first place. Without another word, I stood up, my heart pounding. You know what, Tom? Keep your legacy. I don't need anything from you. As I turned to leave, Mom finally looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. Ben, please don't go like this, but I was done. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself, to make her understand. I was done trying to fit into a family that had never wanted me. That night, I went back to my apartment, feeling more alone than ever. The anger and hurt were overwhelming, but beneath it all, there was a strange sense of relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to hope for something that would never happen. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into my work, focusing on my own life and the people who truly supported me. My friend Ethan was there for me, as always, reminding me that family didn't have to be blood. I started spending more time with people who made me feel valued, who saw me for who I was instead of where I came from. As painful as it was, finding out about Tom's will was the push I needed to finally let go. I didn't have to prove myself to anyone anymore. I didn't need their approval, their validation. I had my own path, my own future, and that was enough. In the end, I realized that family wasn't about blood or legacy. It was about love, support, and respect. And if my so-called family couldn't give me that, then they weren't really my family at all. I was in the middle of an exhausting shift at the grocery store when I got the call that changed everything. The cashier called me over, saying there was a man on the phone looking for me, something about a family matter. I wiped my hands on my apron, puzzled but not really expecting anything big. When I picked up the phone, I heard a crisp voice on the other end introduce himself as Lawrence Moore, an attorney from a law firm I'd never heard of. Mr. Bennett, He began, speaking as if he were delivering news to a CEO and not a grocery clerk. I'm contacting you regarding the estate of your relative, Rose Bennett. I blinked, completely lost. Rose Bennett? The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something from a family story I'd half listened to years ago. But I couldn't place her, and I definitely didn't think she'd be contacting me, or that she'd even remember I existed. Okay. I stammered, still confused. I'm sorry, but I don't think I really knew her. Lawrence cleared his throat, clearly prepared for this response. Ms. Rose Bennett was your father's second cousin. She lived most of her life in California, quite reclusive, but she passed away a few months ago. After a thorough search, you were identified as her closest living relative. My mind raced, trying to piece together what little I knew about my father's side of the family. Dad had left when I was a kid, and I'd never heard much about his relatives. The idea that one of them would even think of me, let alone leave me anything, seemed impossible. But I stayed silent, letting him continue. As her nearest relative, you are the primary beneficiary of her estate, Lawrence said, his tone carefully measured. The assets total approximately $15 million. I nearly dropped the phone. Did he just say $15 million? For a second, I thought this had to be some kind of prank. No way was this real. Wait, you're serious? I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Quite serious, Mr. Bennett. We've processed all necessary documentation, and the funds are ready for transfer upon your approval. However, I'd like to set up a time for you to visit our office to discuss the details in person. After agreeing on a date to meet, I hung up, staring at the phone in disbelief. $15 million. It didn't feel real, not even a little bit. I'd been struggling to make ends meet for so long, working every shift I could get, cutting corners just to keep the lights on. And now, out of nowhere, I was being handed a fortune from a woman I'd barely even heard of. When I arrived at Lawrence's office a few days later, I still felt like I was in some sort of dream. The firm was located in a sleek glass building downtown, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong there. But Lawrence greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a conference room, where he presented me with all the paperwork. Rose Bennett, it turned out, had been a true eccentric. She'd inherited a fortune from her own family but had lived a quiet life, avoiding most people and preferring the company of her books and gardens. According to Lawrence, she'd never married, had no children, and had spent her final years quietly, with only a few close friends who respected her reclusive nature. I believe Ms. Bennett left you this inheritance because she valued independence and resilience, Lawrence explained, looking at me with something like admiration. She instructed us to find a relative who shared those qualities, and after considerable research, we found you. I was speechless. The fact that anyone, let alone a relative I'd never met, would think of me this way was overwhelming. But as the reality of the situation sank in, one thing became crystal clear. I wasn't telling my family about this. After everything I'd been through with Tom, Alex, and even Mom, I knew exactly how they'd react if they found out. They'd suddenly act like they cared, like they'd been there for me all along. Tom would probably try to guilt-trip me into sharing, and Alex would make snide remarks until I caved. And as for Mom, well, I wasn't sure what she'd say, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow expect me to use this windfall to finally prove myself to Tom. But that wasn't going to happen. This was mine, something no one else could take from me. The first thing I did was quit my job. I couldn't wait to tell Jason, my manager, that I wouldn't be coming back. He looked shocked, probably because I'd always been so dependable, but he wished me well, saying he hoped I'd found something better. I just smiled, knowing he had no idea how right he was. Next, I started making plans. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about money. I could live where I wanted, travel, go back to school if I wanted to. The possibilities were endless, and it was exhilarating. But even though I had all this freedom now, I didn't want to make any rash decisions. I decided to take some time to think about my next steps, to figure out exactly what I wanted for my life. In the meantime, I started investing in myself. I moved into a nicer apartment, one with a view of the city skyline, and I bought some decent furniture instead of the hand-me-downs I'd been using for years. I even treated myself to a new wardrobe, replacing the thrift store clothes I'd worn since high school with items that actually fit. One night, as I was looking out over the city from my balcony, I realized just how far I'd come. I didn't have anyone telling me I didn't belong, no one looking down on me or making me feel small. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I'd managed to keep the inheritance a secret for a while, but eventually, word got out. I'm not sure how they found out. Maybe one of my old coworkers saw me around town or noticed the changes in my lifestyle. But one day, out of the blue, I got a call from Mom. "Ben," she said, her voice hesitant. I heard you came into some money recently." My stomach dropped. I hadn't told a soul, and yet somehow, she knew. Yeah, a little," I replied cautiously, not wanting to give anything away. "Oh, Ben, that's wonderful," she exclaimed, suddenly sounding more enthusiastic than I'd heard her in years. "Tom and I were just talking about how we could use a bit of help with some expenses around the house. You know how it is." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom, I don't think I'm in a position to." "Oh, I know, sweetie," she interrupted, her tone turning sickly sweet. "We'd never ask if it wasn't important. But you know how hard it's been for us, with everything going on. And Liam's been needing some extra tutoring. Alex, too, with his college expenses." It was like she'd gone straight into a script, rattling off every expense they had, as if they were all somehow my responsibility. The way she spoke, it was as if she expected me to jump in and offer to cover it all, like I was some sort of backup plan. "Mom," I said, cutting her off. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that." There was a pause, and I could practically feel her shock through the phone. "Ben, I don't understand. This family has always been there for you." I almost laughed at that. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like I've always been the outsider," she sputtered, trying to come up with a response, but I didn't give her the chance. I'd finally found my freedom, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back into their world of manipulation and guilt. After that call, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I'd spent so long feeling like I owed them something, like I had to prove myself. But now, I realized I didn't owe them anything. I could finally live my life on my own terms, without constantly trying to meet their expectations. In the months that followed, I traveled, saw places I'd only dreamed of, and even started my own business, a small but growing tech startup I'd always wanted to pursue. I surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared about me, who supported me without any ulterior motives. As for my family, I kept my distance. I'd spent enough of my life trying to fit into their world, and now that I'd built my own, I wasn't looking back. The moment my family learned about my inheritance, it was like they'd undergone a transformation. Suddenly, I was no longer the outsider, the extra. Now, I was the golden ticket, their one-way pass to an easier life. It was almost laughable how quickly they went from ignoring me to suddenly acting like I was the most important person in their lives. It started with small hints, little nudges from Mom during our rare phone calls. "Ben, it's so wonderful that you've been so blessed," she'd say, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "You know, the house has been needing some serious repairs. The roof, especially. It's been leaking for years." The subtext was clear. She expected me to offer to pay for the repairs. I didn't take the bait. Then, Tom got involved, reaching out himself, something he hadn't bothered to do in years. "Ben," he started, feigning a friendly tone, "Liam's education is incredibly important to us, as you know. The costs keep going up, and we'd hate for him to miss out on opportunities because of finances." Tom tried to play it as though he was doing me a favor, inviting me to be part of Liam's future. But he wasn't fooling me. I knew exactly why he was reaching out, and I knew that if our roles were reversed, he wouldn't even think about helping me. Then there were the more distant relatives, people I hadn't heard from in years, maybe even a decade or more. Cousins, second cousins, aunts, and uncles started reaching out with cheerful, fake pleasantries, sending messages like, "Hey, Ben, it's been so long. We should catch up. By the way, I heard the amazing news." One cousin I barely remembered from a family reunion when I was 7 reached out, saying she had always thought we were close. She quickly transitioned into asking if I'd be willing to help her with a small loan for her business, something she knew I'd be interested in supporting. The level of entitlement was shocking, and I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. At first, I tried to handle it all politely, deflecting and keeping my responses brief. But they wouldn't let up. Mom would call every few days with a new urgent need around the house. Tom emailed me a detailed breakdown of Liam's educational plan, as if he were trying to convince an investor. The final straw was when he sent me a follow-up email with the subject line, "Your duty as part of this family." I nearly threw my phone across the room when I saw that. When it became clear that I wasn't going to give in to their demands, things took an even uglier turn. One evening, I got a formal-looking envelope in the mail. It was a letter from a law firm representing my mom and Tom, stating that they were seeking a portion of my inheritance on the grounds that family members should be supported in times of need. They were suing me, claiming I had a moral obligation to provide for them. I felt a sick mix of anger and disbelief. How far would they go? The same people who had pushed me aside made me feel like I didn't belong. Now they were trying to take away the one thing I had that was truly mine. It was like they couldn't stand to see me succeed on my own. Fortunately, I had Lawrence, the attorney who'd handled Aunt Rose's estate. When I showed him the lawsuit, he barely blinked. He went over the letter carefully, then looked up with a small smile. "Ben, this is just an attempt to intimidate you. They have no legal grounds. Let me handle it." Over the next few weeks, Lawrence dismantled their case piece by piece. He gathered every document, every scrap of evidence showing that they hadn't supported me, that I'd been on my own for years. He even pulled up some financial records that showed I'd been self-sufficient since moving out, while they'd put nothing toward my well-being. After seeing the evidence he'd gathered, I felt like I had an invisible shield protecting me. In the end, their case was thrown out almost immediately. Mom called, crying and trying to guilt-trip me, saying I was tearing the family apart. She accused me of being selfish, of turning my back on the people who raised you. But I stood my ground, something I'd never really done with her before. "I didn't tear the family apart, Mom," I said quietly. "That happened long before I got this inheritance." After that, the calls stopped. Tom sent a few bitter, angry texts, but I ignored them. I felt a strange sense of peace, knowing I'd finally stood up to them and refused to be manipulated. It was a relief, like I'd closed a chapter of my life that I'd been trapped in for years. Now that the drama with my family was behind me, I decided to focus on the people who genuinely cared about me, my friends. Ethan had been there for me through everything, and over the years, I'd made a few other close friends who'd become like family. There was Jade, a fiercely loyal friend I'd met in one of my classes, and Marcus, a coworker who'd shown me what real support looked like. They were the people who'd been there for me without expecting anything in return, and I wanted to invest my time and energy into those relationships. Realizing I needed some help processing all the bitterness, I started seeing a therapist. Dr. Carla Hayes was a warm, empathetic woman who seemed to understand me almost instantly. During our first session, I poured out everything. The years of feeling like an outsider, the manipulation from my family, the hurt of being used as nothing more than a financial lifeline. Dr. Hayes listened, nodding thoughtfully, and when I finished, she looked at me with a kindness that felt genuine. "Ben, it sounds like you've been carrying a lot of weight for a long time. But the fact that you're here, willing to work through this, shows incredible strength." She helped me start unpacking my feelings, showing me how to set boundaries and stand up for myself. For the first time, I began to understand that I didn't have to feel guilty for wanting to be treated with respect. She encouraged me to focus on what made me happy, to surround myself with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them.